Hello, good morning, and welcome to this Logistics Manager webinar sponsored by SSI SCHAEFER. I'm James McLaughlin, Deputy Editor at Logistics Manager, and your host for today's session, which is titled, What Should I Automate First? Automation in the warehouse can deliver significant benefits in terms of efficiency and accuracy, but deciding where to begin can be daunting. This webinar should hopefully provide you with some guidance to help ease these concerns. I'm joined today by Jonathon Buckby, UK Head of Sales for Automation at SSI SCHAEFER. He's here to share his insights into some of the key considerations when it comes to the adoption of automation in the warehouse. Jonathon will talk us through a range of considerations, including the impact of speed of movement on manual operations and weighing the benefits of a single technology versus a multi-area solution. At this point, I'd just like to encourage viewers to ask questions throughout the presentation via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please remember to submit your name, job title, and company name when doing so. I'll pose as many of these questions as possible to Jonathon in the time available following the presentation. There'll also be some polls that will appear on your screen throughout the presentation, so I'd encourage you to engage with those when you see them. Additionally, a recording of this webinar will soon be made available to view on demand via logisticsmanager.com, so look out for that. And with that, I'll now hand over to Jonathon to start the presentation section of this webinar.
Great, thank you, James. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. I'll do a very quick introduction first. As James has already said, my name is Jonathon Buckby. I'm Head of Sales at SSI SCHAEFER. I've been with the organisation and within the industry now for just over a decade in various roles, from manual to automated, and now looking after the entire of the UK pre-sales operation. You've got my email address that's appeared there on the slide, so if there's anything that you do think of regarding any questions that come up after the webinar, please get in touch via email, get in touch on LinkedIn, however's going to work best for you. So as we've said, this webinar is based around how I start the automation process. And really, I want to take a step back first and just look at why we automate first. Maybe some of you that are a bit of a glutton for punishment and maybe attend my previous webinar where this slide will look familiar. But for those that haven't, just to go through again some of the key reasons why many organizations are turning to warehouse optimization, which quite often will include automation. So everyone's reasons differ, and there's always going to be a melting pot of different justifications that cause the need to improve processes. Some great examples and some common ones that I'm sure many of you will be able to relate to are staff. It is increasingly difficult to get the right people at the right price. We have a low unemployment rate at the minute, which is obviously fantastic, and wages rising, which is great news for us as a general populace. But then in terms of business operations, it can create a bit of a headache. We want businesses to grow, obviously, and continue to do more and more and do better and better. And as they do, it creates different strains within the supply chain and within their operations themselves. So again, automation can often come in to help with some of those issues. The flip side of it is obviously looking at us as customers. Our needs change quite quickly, quite regularly. We become more and more demanding in a variety of different ways. For example, we want earlier order windows. We want to get what we want quicker. And that does create some challenges for getting the physical products to the customer. And there's the simple one that's been around since the dawn of time, really, of just finding that space to get everything into. So lots of different reasons why we might look to automate. But understanding that we need to do something is one thing, and knowing where to start is quite another. So again, today we're going to focus on some of those points and looking at areas that might help us start. Everyone's going to be slightly different and everyone's going to have slightly different requirements, but hopefully some of these tips will give you a good insight on where you may begin your own journey. It always seems the most daunting step, doesn't it? It doesn't matter what we're doing or what we're embarking on. But taking that first step often feels like a massive leap, especially in something that is going to be, in some cases, quite a huge change to the business operation. But sometimes what seems daunting actually isn't. And in reality, the first step that we want to take here doesn't need to be. And the reason that we say that is most of the time, the information that you're looking for and where to take that first step is already within the business. You're already the expert in the areas that you want to do. It's just how to extract that, how to use it, and how to really get the most out of your internal information that's going to help facilitate those improvements. So as it says there, step one is often just to take a step back, have a look at your own operations, but perhaps understanding how to use that information to find the pain points is one of the challenges, and hopefully we'll help today with some information on how to do that. But one thing also to point out is where not to start. So quite often we can get drawn in with different technologies because it looks exciting and sexy and new, and the marketing's great for it, and we get really drawn into something. This is the SCHAEFER product range that you can see in front of you now, and it's vast, it's quite impressive, but it can also be quite daunting. We've got everything in there from shelving to shuttles, from cantilever to conveyor, manual, semi-automated, fully automated. But the key message I'm trying to get across here is you should not start with a technology. The reason that I'm saying that is because you will then try and form your business processes around that technology, and it needs to be the other way. The solution has to work for your processes. Now, those processes may change because of what you want to do in the future, and that's obviously perfectly fine. But again, it should be the technology molding and introducing how those processes can change, rather than you going out and saying, well, this technology I really like, how can I make my business work for that? And as we say, the first step is often within, and is not as daunting as perhaps it can often seem. So the first thing I would suggest is look at your products. So have a look around what you're actually doing, and really helping to subdivide those products down into different categories will be an easy first step. So there's lots of different characteristics that can affect how we might try and improve processes within the product range. And if we try and group those, it can really help, again, identify those pain points and what we're looking at. So I've gone for 3 characteristics there that we'll focus on the first 2 certainly today, and special handling I'll touch upon in a moment. But if we start with size, different technologies that, as you can see on the right hand side of your screen there, will be suitable for different size products. So that again is going to give us a great indication straight away on what can be automated, what can't be automated, and how do we handle the others. What proportion of our range does that make up that would fall into uglies, that all need to be considered when I'm looking at the process holistically from start to finish. We then go on to popularity. So every company has an ABC profile. We'll come on to what that is a little bit later. But how do we address that, and how do we deal with different products falling into different categories? What's the relationship? How are we doing lines, orders, and units, and how do we handle that? So for example, if I'm dealing with small products, I might pick by line because that's nice and easy for an operator to pick up. If it's a single item grab at a time, then I'm going to be doing unit picking. So that's a different relationship that needs to factor in, and it shows the relationship between all of these factors as well. So again, popularity really important, and how we can give ourselves a good starting point into the process. And then of course, special handling. Lots of different organizations will have ranges that need certain controls. It may be the whole range, in which case that in some ways makes it a lot simpler, but it may also be part of the range that have got some temperature controls, some explosives controls, or some cost controls, fragile items, all those kind of things. A couple of really simple examples. If I'm dealing with pharmaceuticals, maybe there's some controlled drugs that need to be specially handled. If I'm dealing with food organizations, maybe they have a particular temperature range that needs to be dealt with for a portion of the products. If I was dealing with agricultural supplies, maybe there's some stuff that needs special ATEX ratings, and what technologies are suitable for that. So lots of different characteristics that will come into a special handling consideration too. There's going to be huge overlap and relationships between these 3 different groupings. But again, lots of the information is there. It's not, we're going to talk about data and the quantitative element as well, but also the qualitative is just as important. You guys, again, know your operations better than anyone, and no one should come in and tell you how your operation is running. And you might understand already, well, I know I've got an issue with packing. I've got too many people in picking. I've got this particular headache or that particular headache. You know that. So that's really important to, again, take that step back, understand your business, understand your pain points, and start with your products. And then that might give you a good route into how to optimize. I think at this point, we've also got our first poll question. So I'll just hand quickly back to James to go through that.
So you should all see on your screens a poll question. What makes up the majority of your current intralogistics setup? That's manual, semi-automated, or automated. So please select whichever one best applies to you, and I'll give you a little while to do so. Thanks, guys. I'll be back for the next poll question.
Thank you, James. So as we move on then and start to look at these different characteristics and help try and give this insight on where you might start if you were looking to optimize. Typically, we would say if you're talking about automation, particularly a picking engine, the best place to start is with your smaller items. And there's lots of different reasons for that. As a rough rule of thumb, what we would typically use is anything that fits 4 items or more into a tote, we would class as small or toteable. Anything less than that, we would class as untotable, and I'll come back onto exactly why a little bit later. But the reason that we would start with small is multi-faceted, as we can see here, and I'll just go through the reasons in a moment. But typically, they fall under 2 categories and 2 reasons why we would look at the smaller products first. Firstly, is the obvious, is the physical. So I can get more items within my load unit, whether that's a tote, a carton, a tray, or anything else that we're being stored into. And that has multiple knock-on effects. So what that means is I increase my stock depth. And where I say they're especially relative to time, it's because within any kind of storage system, whether it's manual, semi, or fully automated, we're storing an amount of time's worth of product, whether that's a week, whether that's a month, or whether that's even potentially shorter. And the reason that we focus on it like that is because the knock-on for things like decant replenishment is based on time. It's based on the amount of orders that are placed over a period of time. So that's why that's perhaps more important to look at than physical locations often, because we want to make sure that we've got a good level of stock to cover us for a good amount of time. We're also going to increase the cost efficiency per location. So the more stuff I can get into a smaller area, obviously I'm going to reduce the amount of foot space I use. I'm going to reduce the amount of locations that I need potentially. And really, excuse me, just maximize that cost per location. A reduction of fresh air. Now that may seem like it's the same point that I've made with cost efficiency per location, but actually it's slightly different, and I'll explain why. So obviously these systems, again, manual, automated, semi, or a combination, take up space. And the more space they take up, there's obviously things like business rates that come into per location, there's rent rates that come into per square meter. And even more so if we're talking about frozen and deep freeze, for example, the more cubic meterage I have to freeze within the air, the more that's going to cost. So if I can reduce that fresh air and that physical space of the equipment, there are, again, knock-on effects that has as a positive to a business. There are also process improvements that smaller items can lead into. So if I'm picking large items, it's very difficult for me to get massive benefits when I'm batching because I've still got to pick 1-to-1 ratios. If I've got smaller items, I can typically spread that across more orders with fewer movements. So again, I'm getting a benefit by having to have fewer movements across the equipment, less equipment, and that makes everything far more efficient. I've already touched upon there's a reduction in other processes. I don't have to decant as much, or I can decant easier by just tipping items into a tote, and maybe I don't have to do that as frequently because I've got more items within there. I have simpler flows when I'm transporting things, and what that means is, again, if I link that to something like batch picking, it's not a case of, if I was unit picking, every single retrieval will be one pick. Whereas now, perhaps if I'm retrieving that and batch picking across 2 or 3 orders, I can straight away look at halving the amount of transportation that I need to do, which again, less equipment, more efficient, perhaps less people, because it's an easier process. And I can also improve my grab size. So what a grab size is again, if I'm picking smaller items physically, maybe I can pick up 3 or 4 at a time. And that again makes my picking more efficient. fulfilling more orders, getting things out a lot quicker. All of that factors into that bottom one, which is increases output per movement. So again, lots of different reasons why we would look at smaller items as a starting point. And they factor into the complete holistic solution. So we'll talk about that now and go from kind of front end to back end and why smaller items can give that benefit. Obviously, there's lots of knock on and overlap here, but it's good to look at it holistically. It's also key to point out at inbound and shipping, there is perhaps little control that we can apply, because at inbound, we're receiving that from suppliers. Sometimes we have control over how our suppliers send things. Sometimes we don't. That's just the nature of the beast. And shipping, again, it's our customers. So what they order is what they order. But so less control, but again, still benefits to smaller items as a starting point. So let's start at the beginning. Makes the most sense to start there, doesn't it? So we'll go with inbound. More items per load unit, fewer load units that need to move around the system. Again, there's a benefit from having less equipment. When I'm decanting, the more I can get into a tote, the less totes I'm going to have to go through, more efficient my operation is, lower headcount requirements, and I can also quite often simplify the process with smaller items, especially if I'm talking about non-fragiles, where it becomes easier to dump, say, a carton's worth of stock into a tote. Storage, we've touched upon those reasons, but more items, greater density, less space needed, which are all kind of the same thing, just worded in a different way, but they are all relevant to how I'm going to store things. When I can pick more items easier. Therefore, I need fewer people to do that, because the less movements of equipment that there are, the more picks I can do per retrieval, the faster people can physically pick, the more orders they can fulfill per retrieval as well. And that just smooths up the whole process in terms of speed, efficiency, and fewer headcount requirements. And that also means fewer station requirements. So again, less equipment, less cost. When I get to packing, there are multiple technologies out there, such as auto baggers and other pieces of equipment which are suitable for smaller items. When we get to larger items, there's obviously pallet wrapping that can be automated. But if I was doing larger customer orders, sometimes that can be a bit tricky. So the smaller items, again, if I can segregate those off and have particular orders that are just small items, they can go through an automated process. And when I get to shipping, smaller load units, reduce that cost of the final mile, because I can get more into a van or a lorry or however it is that we're shipping. There's also some efficiency and sustainability benefits at that end because of the emissions that would be caused from final mile delivery. Excuse me. But what we can see there is that at every step, there is a clear and obvious reason why I think we would maybe, if we do have a range of products, think, well, maybe the smaller ones are a good place to start with, because it can create a cheap system run by fewer people. So I get CapEx and OpEx benefit through looking at my small items first. One of the reasons we said as well that we would typically say 4 items per tote is it's a rule of thumb. So obviously there's going to be exceptions to that. But typically that's when we're starting to say, okay, well, if I'm having to decant it that quickly, I'd have to pick it so quick. I'd likely have to pick it and then re-decant and replenish so quickly that it doesn't make sense to do that. As we said, though, always exceptions to that rule. So we would look at everything individually. And I can give you a case study where we've implemented something like this. So I'm sure we're all familiar with Harrods, the high-end department store, and that they do kind of anything and everything, all within the luxury space. So what they have, and in the process of extending actually, is a mini load system with some picking stations on the front end. But they also, as you can see down here in our scope section, they have some manual pallet racking, mezzanine, and shelving from us too. The reason that they have this system is for the health and beauty products, so small items typically, and that's purely for the reasons that we've been through already. I can get tons into a tote. That gives me great stock depth. My picking can be really efficient because I can service multiple orders at a time. And I will service my larger ugly items within the manual pallet racking and the mezzanine as well, and the shelving. And they find that this really gives them the best flow of product. So one example there of why we would start with slow items and how we can get a benefit from it. I think it's now time for question number 2. So I'll just hand back to James for a moment.
Thank you. So yeah, we've got another question that should be on your screen. So just select the option that suits you. So when are you planning to automate? Is it in 12 months? Is it between 1 to 3 years, or is it in 3 years' time? If you could just select that, I'll give you some time to choose.
Thank you again. So it looks like lots of us are starting this process and starting to think about how we're going to improve the operation, which is great. And I really hope that today can give you some info to take away and start that journey. So we've just spoken about size, and something we also mentioned earlier is the popularity of our SKUs and how that's really important and might give us an indication on where we should begin our journey. So I've got 2 examples there on the right hand side of different operations, and what you can see is a fairly typical curve. Again, I'm sure many of you will see similar within your businesses, where the fastest moving SKUs might be a very small proportion of the range, but they do a huge proportion of the throughput, and then we end up with a very large tail. The chart at the top, where you've just got the numbers, that's roughly 3% of the SKUs doing about 40% of the movement. So obviously the inverse is true for the back end. We might be familiar, but I'll go through what we class A, B, and C items as, just to give those that perhaps aren't a bit more of an insight. So A movers, as the name suggests, will be the fastest moving SKUs. Usually we would say you'd look at no more than 5 to 10% of the range here. Again, everyone's curve is going to be different, so that's not to say that's a hard and fast rule, but again, hopefully it gives an insight on what we do. The reason is that proportion usually accounts for a really high proportion of the throughput, again 30, 40, perhaps even higher as a percentage. As you can see as well on the top, we even have a AA classification for some organizations, where there are maybe 5 to 10 SKUs that do a huge amount of throughput and need to be treated slightly differently for that reason. Maybe you've got, for example, inserts that you include on every order. Well, maybe that's treated as an individual SKU and needs to be handled in a different way. But when I do that, it means that I'm doing such a high proportion. I really need to consider how I'm going to do that, and am I going to do that in the same way I treat everything else? Probably not. We then go on to the B movers. Again, we'd say kind of 15 to 30% of the range. Really depends on how that curve ends up looking. But it can be usually this. It can often be, when we look at the charts again, it's the same amount of throughput roughly as the A movers, but from a far wider SKU base. And again, it's just how we treat that. Do we treat them differently? Do we treat them the same? How flat is our curve? How steep is our curve? All these things will come into it. And then finally, we've got the slow movers. So it's the tail of the curve. It's usually the largest portion of the SKU range, but obviously a very small amount of the throughput. And if we just look at the graph here, we can see it's less than 5% being done, 5% of the throughput being done by 40% of the SKUs. And at the top, even it's a far lower proportion of that, half the SKUs doing 2 to 3% of the throughput. It's very low. Everyone's curve is going to be different, and we have to look at these things. But again, it's the information is usually all there. Whether that's just known, whether that's tracked through a software system, or whether that is qualitative information just through experience, something that we can always look at. Another thing that can often be missed, and we should try and factor in where possible, is an XYZ. Now, an XYZ is different to an ABC, but linked, and that's the consistency of movement. Now, why is that important? We may be dealing with an organization where we look at data over time, say over a 6-month period, and there might be a SKU that pops out as an A mover. But actually that particular product was on special offer for a week, and it was on a really good offer, and everyone took it up. So for that week, it might have been an A mover, but the rest of it might be a C mover. So in that instance, that would have a Z criteria because it's very volatile in terms of its movements. An X would be very consistent in its movement. It's always an A mover, always a B, always a C. And then the Y kind of, again, bridges that gap between the two. So it's important to factor that in, because if we're going to treat skews differently, they're going to move over time. That's natural. Different things become popular at different times. But if I'm a fashion business, for example, where I've got that seasonality, something we need to try and look at again, so we can just layer the complexity without having to do too much, but layer the efficiency and complexity gains from any kind of solution. So we understand our curve, we understand what we're trying to look at, but it doesn't really tell us where to start, does it? So where would we start? And this is the bit that often gets some reactions, which is we would quite often say to start slow. It does sound counterintuitive. Why am I going to spend my business's hard-earned money on focusing on the movers that don't do much throughput? And it's a valid question. It really is. So I've created a very simple example here to try and highlight why we typically say slow movers are a good place to start. What I've done there is a very simplistic, as you can tell by the drawing, layout. Imagine it was shelving in a manual picking operation. They've done some optimization already, which is fantastic. They've created a green area for my fastest moving, my A's, and I've got an orange area for the B's, and then the C's are at the back to try and get them out of the way and reduce that impact. I've used some very simple numbers to keep it easy for me in terms of the amount of SKUs. It adds up to 100, nice and easy for us to work out percentages, and the picks adds up to 1,000. Again, nice and easy for my very simple salesperson's brain. We've also multiplied across the locations per SKU, because if I'm optimizing my system, I'm not going to have one location for everything, am I? I'm going to have more locations for my A movers, fewer for my C's. What we factored in here is if I was to take that order profile, which would be fairly standard, 5% doing 40% for my A movers, and then the last 80% doing 25% of the throughput for my C's. What's my average travel distance? How many bays do I have to go past per pick on average? And as you can see, obviously it's lower for the A's and higher for the C's. Well, then if I multiply the picks by that average travel distance, what I can see is I'm 3 times as inefficient on my slow movers as I am for my fast movers. So I've got 3 times the walking distance, and that walking distance is dead time. So actually, in this particular operation, yeah, I've done some optimization, and that's fantastic, but I'm still getting headaches with my C movers. So it's still the slow movers that are causing any kind of inefficiencies and are really dragging the operation backwards rather than pushing it forwards. So that's an example in terms of the picking. Hopefully it's nice and clear. Again, happy to go through anything offline with the contact details I shared before. But really the slow movers, just because of the width and the breadth of space that they're going to take up, but I still need to store them because someone could order them, really do have an impact, and the largest impact on what we're doing. So that's in terms of a picking perspective, but there's other reasons too that we should look at the slow movers. So if I was going to automate part of my operation for whatever reason, and I said, okay, I'm going to look at fast and slow as my differentiator. If I then had a manual area for whatever the rest is, we've already seen, if I was just to put the fast movers in that automated, semi-automated area, whatever it would be, I'd still have huge walking distances. So actually, I'm not tackling the challenge that I want to do. Let's inverse that. If I am to store my slow movers in an automated, semi-automated area, what's left is very small. So the efficiency that I'm going to have from doing a pick walk, yes, it's still not the most efficient way of doing it because there's still walking, but it's far better because the green area is the smallest. So that's going to be the easiest way to have a manual area outside of something automated. The other factor, obviously, that comes into it is a storage versus throughput ratio. I may have excess. If I need to design something based on throughput specifically, I'm going to have quite a short system which might not be as cost effective as having a longer system where the price per location then starts to drop down. But again, that's on an individual basis, really. But the manual area is definitely one to consider. I also need to think about replan. If I'm picking it quicker, I need to replan it quicker. So if I'm replanning my fast movers, obviously I need to do that more often. If it's in an automated system, maybe there's a decant operation that comes in, and maybe there's lots of other things. So if my fast movers are really fast moving, should I decant them at all? Should I just have them picked off a pallet, for example? Comes into it. And we've touched upon a few reasons there that would also factor into the cost. But typically it's more cost effective, especially on a per location basis, to automate those slower movers. So again, it still maybe seems counterintuitive to say, well, I'm going to spend my money on my slowest moving items, but actually it's about identifying that pain point. And we can see with this very oversimplified example, I'll take on board, is the slow movers can and often are what creates that big inefficiency pain point, especially with picking and walking routes. And we've got a great example here. So this is Cole's EFC5 in America. It's an absolutely ginormous shed. There are very few larger anywhere on the planet. 1,300 shuttles across 54 aisles is an absolute beast of an installation. But even for something as large and as automated as this, with multiple sortation loops, conveyor lines, and shuttle systems, what they use for fast movers and peak periods such as Black Friday and Christmas is they have this light blue picking tower, and they do that manually because the overflow system and the fast movers are more efficiently picked in that way. So again, even with a huge system with a large level of investment, quite often it's the manual pick area that's better suited to fast movers and the slow movers in the automation rather than the other way around. I think it's at this point as well, I hand back over to James for the final poll question.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that excellent presentation. Before we get onto the Q&A, we have one final poll question that should be on your screens now. So after hearing today's webinar, what parts of your operation will you focus on optimizing? Is it A, only the big pain points, B, only a few of your processes, or C, as much as possible? And I'll give you some time to answer that now. Brilliant. Well, thank you guys for that.
So the final section we'll look through is looking at single versus multi-technology solutions. We said right at the start, don't focus on the technology and then build around it. It's about making the technology work for your process and operation. So even after we've gone through the analysis, that still stays true. And what it means is sometimes there will be a situation where a single technology works best, and other times there might be huge gaps between those product characteristics that we've got, which mean actually I need to tackle different products in different ways. Neither answer is right or wrong. It really depends on what we're looking for. And as we can see with the graph on the right hand side, there's different technologies to deal with different storage and throughput needs. And really why we might look at different things come down to a number of factors. We've already touched upon many of them, but there are key considerations as well when I look at a multi-technology site. I'll just quickly try and go through some of these. So the first is the software. When I'm talking about multi-technology sites, the software then is really essential to knit everything together, to understand how orders are going to interact with each other, how those different areas will interact with each other, and also just making sure that everything's getting the same level of information backwards and forwards, linking with other ERP systems, for example. Transport, it seems fairly simplistic, but again, how am I going to move things between different areas? Is that manual? Is it automated? Do I want to put in bypasses so that not everything has to go to each area? Do I need extra redundancy, extra lines to go in for that reason? Lots of factors that come in there. What product goes into what area too? So those rules of separation. There may be very strict reasons why certain things go in certain areas. Again, for example, pallets versus totes, for example, is a very simplistic one. Temperature range is another. But there could be reasons why things go in other areas than don't. But on the flip side of that, there may also be some flexibility of product we need to consider. if I've got a range of product that's in there due to throughput reasons, for example, and I introduce a new SKU, how understanding where that's going to go, why it's going to go there, for how long it's going to go there, we're really important to make sure that everything is as efficient as possible moving forwards. It's not to say once you design something for one particular set of parameters, that's how it's going to be forever. Of course it's not. So how do we flex when that changes? There's obviously pros and cons for each. Again, it will come down to what you need and what the data tells us and what you tell us in terms of your processes and what you're looking to achieve. If I'm to take the single, for example, it's usually a simpler implementation because I'm only installing one piece of technology. The IT interfaces are simpler. I've got one box to work from. The maintenance is simpler. I've got one lot of spares and I'm only dealing with one particular system that needs to be looked after. Whereas if I go to the multi, I get perhaps a complexity benefit. So I can target different areas of the business. And is it better for me to maximize saving per area or just maximize saving across the organization? Again, the results will differ. I can really focus the operations down too more. I can focus on picking or packing or picking of one particular set of items compared to another. That'll help me reduce my headcount further by having a more targeted approach. I will have less wastage. If I'm designing a single system, for example, maybe I design it for either storage or throughput. Maybe I've got an excess in one because of the balance and the way the system works that I'm never going to eat into. And also I can increase the level of flexibility that I have if I've got multi-solutions. As we said, if I'm moving things between different technologies because the characteristics of that product change, or we introduce a new SKU, that is far easier to do if I've got multiple areas to do it rather than just one technology to pump everything towards. And again, we've got a really nice example here of a site in Peterborough for Lineage, where we've got a mobile racking solution here on the right hand side, which is extremely dense. But the reason we've got that there is for Lineage are a 3PL customer, so they store pallets in a cold store for other customers. And what they will have here is 1 or 2 pallets of a particular SKU for smaller customers, which is best suited to go in this mobile racking. And then they've got an automated high bay, which is channel store, so that's 3 deep. And for those customers that are then maybe storing trucks worth of a particular SKU at a time, they're better off storing it in that automated system because it's going to be there for longer and they're going to just pump more into the system. So it makes a lot more sense to do that. And again, this just allows them to cater for all their customers. If their customers' needs change, they can move from one to the other, nice and simply. But it gives them that flexibility to do that. And because of that customer range is exactly why Lineage decided to go with a multi-technology solution. So just to summarize, this is my last slide. I'm sure many of you will be glad to hear. Every business is different. Processes are always different. Goals are always different. And we need to treat everything in a unique way to try and get the most out of it. But what is the same is we're all looking to improve. We're all looking to get better, do things faster, and just make our businesses stronger wherever we can. I'm ready to summarize the areas we've covered today. The focus has got to be on those pain points. Again, they're different for everyone. So understanding what those pain points are and can we justify that with data or more information from the shop floor will really help everyone and yourselves have a good understanding of where to start. As we say, start small. So standardized small products often can help us take care of a huge chunk of the product range quite simply and quite easily, but they also give that benefit in terms of decant picking, storage density, many other things. And the slow moving point too. So slow movers can often have the most inefficiencies around them. Again, it may not sound right to spend the money on the slow movers, but actually then that makes the fast movers more efficient too, as well as having a huge impact on the slow movers. So it has the most holistic benefit. First step is often the most difficult one. I hope that we've given some information that's been of some use to you and helps with your journeys. As James said, we've got a Q&A session now, so more than happy to answer any questions that anyone might have with the remaining time.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, so now will be the right time. If you've got any questions that you've not already put in the Q&A function, please type those out now. Before we get onto the questions from the audience, I'd just like to start by asking, you spoke about looking at slow and small products first, but what if your range has a flat throughput and only deals with larger items?
Yeah, it's a challenge that comes up. It's more often that we see the curves, but it does come up that we see some larger items and some flatter curves. With the flatter curves, especially, that topic typically would mean maybe a single technology solution is the way to go, because we can treat everything more similarly than we could if there was a steeper curve. With larger items, again, it's not to say that automation won't work. Of course it will. There's just a different way of doing things. For example, pallets or furniture, we have to deal with slightly separately, but it means that the ways of handling them is different. So the efficiency gains are different to if I'm looking at, small standardized products.
And what's your view on using consultants to help identify those first steps?
Really good, actually. Consultants can prove really beneficial because they come from typically backgrounds of dealing either within the organizations that have looked to optimize, or occasionally from companies that have provided automation or other solutions in the past, and they can help give a really independent view by taking in all the information and just giving out what they believe an answer could be. With consultants, there's a range of what they cover, and there's a range of specialisms. So again, I would say take your time in going out and finding the right one, because these guys are going to work with you for a very long time. So it's just really important to get one that you're comfortable with, that you feel has good experience in dealing with something similar, and can help you move forwards. But no, consultants are often a very good step.
And also, could the same methodology be applied to manual or semi-automated solutions?
Yeah, absolutely. So whilst it was a focus on automation, and that was the title, if I was going from manual to semi-automated, the same would be true. If I was, for example, looking to implement a vertical lift system, again, it's got one pick face per unit, so I would want to put my slow movers in there to stop over traffic going into there. But again, I get more density from my small items too. So that's one example, but there are many more. If you were looking at a semi-automated system, perhaps a step change, or as that as your process improvement, you could absolutely apply the same rules.
And we've got a question here from the audience. Would your advice be, if the Pareto analysis for SKU movements wasn't an 80-20, instead more evenly distributed, would you still suggest focusing on the slow movers?
Yes, we would, because typically that would still mean that the largest proportion of SKUs will fall into that range. But again, similar to what we just said about the flatter curves, it may mean that everything is more similar, and actually that leads us to a single technology piece. Everything has to be looked at individually, of course. But yeah, I would still say start with the slower movers. It just may well be that the differentiation or the proportion of SKUs may be smaller, depending on where that throughput line is across the board.
We've got another question. You discussed ABC locations when picking products, but would you use a similar system to store the surplus stock until it's needed for replenishment?
You could well do. Again, it really depends on the storage strategy. And this comes back to when we were talking about small items and talking about storing a time's worth of stock rather than necessarily an amount of units. Because if I'm storing a time's worth of stock, that will be the same whether it's an A mover, a B mover, a C mover. I will just have more locations for the fast moving items. So what that means is if I'm looking at a bulk store, it becomes less important because I'm going to have to visit everything on a spread basis. So if I'm storing a week's worth of A movers, I'm going to replan that once a week. If I'm storing a week's worth of B movers, I'm going to do that once a week. So then that helps. Really, it's never going to be perfect, right? Data and reality often differ, and who knows what the future holds. But if I can flatten out that replenishment curve by having a good amount in terms of time within my automated, manual, semi-automated system, whatever that is, it really helps just make my bulk storage a bit simpler because everything's flattened out.
And for multi-technology solutions, would you recommend doing it all in one go or in steps?
Up to the organization, really. There's the reasons why you would do it all in one go. For example, it's a lower disruption period, and over the course of the entire installation, it's a lower cost than doing a step change. But maybe I get different capex at different times, so actually that helps me with step changing the process. Also, there's things like it's easier for employees to do step change rather than all in one go. And there might be certain processes that are causing me really big pain, but actually it's only one or two. And in that instance, I'm just going to focus on those. So again, it's horses for courses, and we would typically look at everything on a unique basis. But whether that is step change or whether that is one go, either would work.
And have you done, or is there plans for a webinar to show types of automated technology to show what the options are for implementing new technology?
Absolutely, we could do that. I think one of the challenges is we showed at the start, our range is really wide, and the application of technology across different markets is very different. So, for example, I may use a mini load for bulk storage in one organization, picking for another. I may use it for spare parts in another. And so making sure that we hit all those individual points is it is quite challenging over a set period of time. So what I would suggest is if everyone does have any individual requirements or individual questions, or wants to go through technology for their own organization and look at the different options, please get in touch. We're more than happy to either go through that and arrange a call with you individually, or I can set up that with a member of my team. But yeah, we could do that, but I think it would be better to be focused and targeted on each individual organization so we don't miss anything.
Brilliant. Well, that brings us to the end of this webinar. I'd like to thank SSI SCHAEFER's UK Head of Sales for Automation, Jonathon, for joining us this morning. I'd also like to thank SSI SCHAEFER for sponsoring today's webinar, which will be available to view on demand soon via logisticsmanager.com in case you'd like to revisit the presentation or share it with a colleague. So that's it. We've reached the end. Thank you all for attending today's session. I've been James McLaughlin, and I look forward to seeing you all again for the next Logistics Manager webinar. Until then, goodbye.